starts, I want to ask you to mute their microphones. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing from you, Rachel.
Thank you. Right, so the first challenge, more techie challenges, is to share my screen. Oh, I can't share my screen, unfortunately. It says the host is disabled. Do you just need to
Yeah, I
change
just need to
my,
quickly change something.
I always love the wording in Zoom. I get promoted to co-host. Feels good, doesn't it? So yes, as Elizabeth said, this is where I totally hold my hands up and say my background isn't in botany. And I'm probably talking to a bunch of botany experts here, but yes, my background is in marine biology. And actually, before I joined Plant Life, gosh, just over 5 years ago, I was actually coordinating, again, a nationwide citizen science project, but in that instance, monitoring seabirds and cetaceans. So very, very similar, except those species had a rather frustrating habit of jumping under the water when you were trying to count them. But perhaps I might argue I find those easier to identify as well. So, you know, swings and roundabouts. But yes, I joined the National Plant Monitoring Scheme because really survey methodology, data standardization, citizen science, volunteer management, and really just being a real advocate for the huge value the volunteers bring to data collection and research. Those are all very much my bag. So if I can now share my screen
now.
There we go. Are you all able to see that? Is that just yes, that's just one big slide?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Phew, hurdle over and done with. That's brilliant. So yes, I'm the volunteer manager, basically, for the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. And I was asked, as Elizabeth said, to give the talk today about the NPMS, which I'm going to call it from now on, so it's slightly shorter to say, and about how we are using this scheme to monitor change in our UK habitats. As you say, the Inverness Botany Group has had a survey square with us since 2017, which is absolutely fab. I'm not sure how many people joining us in the group today have been part of that, or, you know, many of you, I'm sure, NPMS may be new. So hopefully, as you say, Elizabeth, we can maybe inspire folk to have a little go on the square after today's talk. So just to give you a bit of an outline of what I plan to talk about this evening, I'll give you a bit of a background about the NPMS, why it was started. I can also briefly chat about how it works in terms of what our volunteers do on the ground for anybody who hasn't taken part in the surveys to date. And then I thought I would run through some of the data uses of the data that's being collected and how this volunteer collected data has been put into practice, basically, thus far in research and in monitoring. And I've also just prepared just a couple of slides just to highlight how you can find out more about the scheme afterwards if you're interested, our research, even perhaps how to get involved in some of our other opportunities and where to find out the information, basically. So just for full disclosure, I am joining you today in the midst of bedtime for two very excited young boys. While I'm sure my husband is expertly navigating the situation, I thought I would just mention it in case we hear any complaints or cries of outrage. So I just let you know that as well. So as a really initial introduction, the National Plant Monitoring Scheme, or as I say, the NPMS, as the name suggests, is a UK-wide scheme. It is a citizen science, habitat-based plant monitoring scheme, and it covers the major freshwater and terrestrial semi-natural habitats. So the scheme really provides an indication of changes in plant diversity and abundance across these UK habitats and through time. And it really helps us to gain a better understanding of habitat health. So it was designed, gosh, around 2012 to meet the need really for a standardised approach to plant monitoring. And that was really identified as a high priority within the terrestrial biodiversity surveillance strategy. And that was published by the Joint Nature Conservation Committee in, I want to say, somewhere between 2005 and 2008. I can't think off the top of my head. The basis of the NPMS is that across the UK, monads, or simply put, 1 kilometre squares, there we go, that worked, like this one, have been randomly designated, and volunteers up and down the country can request and allocate themselves one or more of these survey squares, I should say, to survey twice a year. And it's fair to say the scheme is only made possible by the amazing efforts and the time put in by our dedicated volunteers, who we are incredibly grateful to. But that is really a whistle-stop tour. I can go into a little bit more detail. So if we take a little bit of a step back in time and think about sort of the broader context, we can look at sort of the broad trajectory of plant recording and distribution mapping in Britain and Ireland over the 20th century. And the general theme, especially where volunteer natural history is concerned, captured by this trajectory, is sort of pre-1940 or Victorian and earlier 20th century, really is local floras, where people mainly tended to note distributions of species in Britain in terms of localities, and often very summary descriptions of common species, and only really going into greater detail for the rarer and scarce species and taxa, dare I say, those that were a little bit more exciting at the time. And then, of course, the atlasing bug took hold with the first BSBI plant atlas in 1962. Then there was a resurvey towards the end of the 20th century, which was published in 2002. And through that, actually, there were another couple of initiatives. So first, they put that latest atlas and all the information online. So they digitized it all in 2012. And the hybrid flora was then published in 2015. And this year, oh, actually, it's not this year. I keep forgetting we're with the other side of New Year. Last year, that's gone by in a whiz, there was published the BSBI Atlas 2020, which is an absolutely amazing resource if you haven't yet seen it. It's an absolute beast of an atlas, two huge books, but they have also digitized the whole thing. It's all online, and it is an incredible resource, providing information about all the species recorded in the UK. Then, of course, we have inserted here the National Plant Monitoring Scheme, which started in 2015 with some experimental years before that. And that's what's still running today, and I'll be chatting about. And they've obviously all got different scopes and purposes, but it's really useful to consider what is out there, how all this information complements each other. And it's also worth noting that large-scale distribution mapping, as illustrated, I hope this works, yes, by the Parnassa or the grass of Parnassus, plots on the left here, you can see they've been really effective at capturing, this is just an example of a species, they've been really effective at capturing the distributions at a sort of a large 10-kilometre scale nationally. And you can see there just how between those three atlases, the distribution knowledge is kind of in field from new surveys and the digitization of historical data, but it's also giving us some insights into the change at those scales. And just that little graph there is the long-term trend from the atlas in 2020, so the latest BSBI atlas trend for Parnassa. And it's a little bit of a sad tale of loss, particularly in the lowlands, but perhaps that's now extending to its strongholds as well. So hopefully we can consider some things to do to revert this. So that's really a broad scale picture. And there's really always been an interest in plants associations with their habitats historically, their communities, their niches at different scales, what environmental conditions they need to survive, and they need indeed to survive. And that's what we're really interested in the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. So it really provides an indication of changes in plant diversity and abundance, as I say, across the habitats through time. And in the UK, we may well be aware there are really long-standing continuous schemes for monitoring populations of bats, for birds, for butterflies, for example, with the annual British Bird Survey and the British Butterfly Monitoring Scheme. But actually, until the NPMS began, there wasn't something similar. There wasn't a similar systematic scheme for plants. So with, major changes taking place and declines in biodiversity across habitats being reported, whether through habitat change, nutrient enrichment, climate change, and so on, it really became crucial to have a better understanding of plant populations and how these can provide us with insights into the health of our habitats. So there was, and I'd say there still is, a need for large scale coverage and this systematic approach over time. Otherwise, really, there's a potential to miss any trends and any patterns in what we're seeing. And there's also really been a steer from professionals towards collecting more finely resolved data, sort of at that finer scale. It was highlighted that there was a gap, at least in the voluntary natural history area, that could potentially be filled by asking, expert naturalists, people who really know their thing, out in the field, know their areas, who look at plant communities and abundances at smaller scales within habitats. And that is, of course, where we come in with NPMS. So there was a report actually produced by Kevin Walker, who's the head of science, and others at BSBI and Plantlife. That was really about an early scoping stage for the NPMS, thinking about what sort of things might be practical to do across the UK in terms of recording plants and habitats, and of course in a standardised way, using the skills and the experience of volunteers. And as you can see with the quote here, the aim really was to provide or to improve the UK's ability to report on and respond to the state of the natural environment. And as I say, there was an emphasis on a desire for finer scale data to better inform us about national trends. So here we can see the 4 original partners that came together in 2012. Whenever I say that, I think it sounds like the Marvel characters or the Avengers coming together to do something about the situation. And really, they came together to devise the scheme and the methodologies. And then a pilot was run in 2014. And in 2015, the NPMS was launched proper, as it were. That was the first proper field season, and that actually makes 2024, this season, it's going to be the 10th year that the scheme has run and that data has been collected. Oh, I don't know what's going on there. There we go. The last couple of years, really, I would say have been pivotal for the scheme, because we're now starting to get enough data, or we now do have enough data to start looking at trends and indicators. And that can be the really tricky thing about working within a long-term monitoring scheme or taking part in a long-term monitoring scheme. Of course, it takes a number of years to really start to build up the information that allows you to start looking at these trends and start conducting the analysis. So these 4 partners that I've mentioned here, we have the BSBI, the UKCEH, the JNCC, and Plantlife. So JNCC is the public body that advises the UK government and devolved administrations on UK-wide and actually on international nature conservation. There's the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, which is it's an independent, not-for-profit research institute, and that carries out environmental science across land, sea and air. BSBI, I'm sure many of you are well aware of the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland. It's a society for anybody interested in the flora of Britain and Ireland. And actually in more recent years, we've also been supported by DERA, the Department for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs in Northern Ireland, with the scheme's expansion to Northern Ireland in more recent years. So along with these partners, the scheme was co-developed with volunteers on the ground during an inclusive trial phase with contributors and volunteers from a variety of backgrounds and experiences. It really is important that the scheme is accessible and it is inclusive, while of course still maintaining robust and standardised methodology and data standards. So a methodology needs to be found that was going to be really repeatable, really accessible, but was going to be really robust and provide really valuable data. So as I say, this year, we're very excited. It's going to be our 10 years worth of collecting data out in the field. So as I said, there were previously no robust surveys for plants that matches these other species groups. And so there was a need to establish the scheme. It needed to include semi-natural habitats beyond protected sites. And looking at what the data can tell us, the scheme really aimed to provide habitat inventories and contribute to remote sensing. It also wanted to investigate drivers of change using NPMS data. So considering, for example, climate change, habitat management, so how these sites are being managed, invasive species, pollution, gosh, all sorts, coastal management, pests and pathogens, lots of different things that could be impacting our habitats. So to really quickly sort of revisit and think about the basics, the aim of the scheme is to really provide reliable measures of change for individual species and species groups within these semi-natural habitats, and to use both positive and negative indicators for each species. So these are species that have been identified as positive indicators of habitat health, so they indicate good habitat health, and negative indicators. And they were included and chosen because they were reliable indicators of habitat health, but also they're species that are relatively widespread, well-known, and relatively easy to identify. The survey design needed to be straightforward, repeatable, and achievable, as I say. And so to look a little bit more into the basics, we can see here, once a surveyor or a group, such as yourselves, have allocated themselves a randomly designated square, they are to establish up to 5 plots, smaller plots, which would ideally represent different NPMS habitats, but importantly represent the survey square, or really where is accessible and safe to survey within the square that is an NPMS habitat type. And the surveyors record the abundance of indicator species and any other plot characteristics. And this survey is carried out twice a year, once in late spring and again in late summer. So really speaking, we ask folk to head out to their squares twice a year to survey these smaller plots. We don't ask them to survey the whole kilometre square. It'd be like those window washers on the really tall buildings. Once they've finished, they'd almost have to be starting again. So we just get them to ask them to survey smaller, more manageable areas. So you can see here there are 28 fine NPMS habitats nested within 11 broad categories. And as I say, there's a range of positive and negative indicator species within each that we ask recorders to volunteer to record within their plots. As I say, when we say indicator species, we mean these are either positive indicators or negative indicators of habitat health. So within the square allocated to yourselves, the Inverness Botany Group, I believe, have I managed to get pictures? I have. I believe we've got 3 plots that have been created. We've got plot 1, plot 2 there, and you can see plot 3, all within dry deciduous woodland. And plot 3 is actually a linear plot. You see it probably follows along that footpath there. So there are 3 plots currently created by the Inverness Botany Group, which is lovely to see. And also a big thank you for uploading your photos while you've been entering the data. Each volunteer or group, prior to recording the species in field, decides which level they wish to survey at. So as I mentioned previously, this was part of the scheme being made flexible and accessible to a wider group of participants. So we have the 3 different survey levels. We have the wildflower level, which is a reduced list of more easily identifiable species, divided into lists applicable for habitats. There's around 10 to 15 species per habitat in the wildflower list. We also have the indicator level, which is an expanded list of just over 400 species in total. And again, that's divided into groups applicable for the different habitats. And it just really includes some species which are a little bit more challenging to identify. So for example, more grasses, sedges and ferns and such. So it's around, I believe there's around 35 species per habitat to identify. And then we have the inventory level, which is designed for volunteers who are capable of recording all vascular plant species which they find in a habitat, which is what you chaps have been surveying at that level and entering data. So you have been recording all species that you've been finding within your plots each time you survey. So the wildflower level is relatively simpler level in that there's that reduced list, there's the sort of intermediate indicator level, and then the inventory level, which you've been recorded at, and impressively been submitting data at this level for the last 7 years. So as you can see on the map here, you can see all of our NPMS squares shown. So we've got really good coverage over the UK, and they are either orange, which means that they've been allocated to a volunteer or a group, or they are blue, which means they are still currently available. We have around 1,500 volunteers currently allocated to a square, and actually some volunteers take on more than one square. We have some volunteers that take on, we tend to say not to take on more than 5 squares. We do have a few volunteers that have 2, 3, 4 squares, and we have some groups that have taken on 5 or 6 squares to work on between them. So there really is a large variety. I believe to date we have, gosh, I'm trying to think now, more than 1,000 squares nationwide with data having been returned in the last years of the scheme, but with at least 1 year, 2, 3, and some all the way up to 9 years worth of data. And nationally, it's worth saying as well, our brilliant community of volunteers have amassed data from over 7,000 surveys by the end of last season. So that's not even got the surveys and the figures in from the season that's just ended, because we tend to run that analysis through the winter, which we haven't yet finished. So you can find a map similar to this on the NPMS website if you'd like to take a look. You can see, this is where I shamelessly plug, you can see there are still plenty of blue squares available, and we do tend to release squares that are inactive, or if anybody moves, squares do become available. So I thought I'd just include here slightly zoomed in map in the area surrounding Inverness, just to demonstrate how many squares we have, how many active squares there are in the region, shown in orange, and similarly how many squares are currently available, shown in blue. So we do really have good coverage of our squares. There's not huge distances between them. So I thought, why not have a little look at the square that is allocated to the Inverness Botany Group, NH7560, super catchy name, but the grid reference for this square. So this is a really interesting square. It's a coastal square. We have 3 plots you can see in blue there that we currently have data collected for, all within the woodland. And I thought it's just worth noting as well, interestingly, it does also overlap with the Rosemarkie to Shandwick Coast SSSI, which I'm sure you guys will know a lot more about than I do. And you may see some familiar faces here. I don't know if anybody wants to shout out some names. I believe that the top photo here was in 2021. Is that Mary Rowe? Is that Elizabeth? I think you might be in that picture too. I'm not sure. Yeah, you are. Thumbs up. So I just thought it was a chance for me to say thank you really while you're here, because over a 7-year period, we've got 5 years of data from the group, which is incredible, particularly, considering we had COVID during those 7 years as well. And over those 5 years, we have received data from 30 surveys, and from which we've got data contributed. You have recorded with us 109 species thus far, altogether across those 5 years. And actually that amasses over 720 records you've submitted altogether to the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. So that's where I give a big clap and a big thank you very much for all of your efforts. It was nice to show just a couple of snaps that you've submitted with alongside your data. Incredible effort. So now we move on to the data and that we've got back and how it's being used, and the insights we're starting to glean. And I should say, while we are going into our 10th year of the scheme, we are actually relatively very young as long-term monitoring schemes go. It really takes time for these schemes to grow, for word to spread and more people to get involved, and then set up their plots and start recording for their different habitats, and particularly for those habitats to be represented sufficiently within the data set. Of course, we also need to build up a number of years of data before we can start to see trends and stories emerge. But happily now we are in the position where we are seeing these insights emerging. So First of all, just quite a simple map here. This is the latest count of habitat plots across the scheme at broad habitat level. And the map there is just across all of these at the 1 kilometre square resolution across all of the habitats, just to show the broad distribution of where we've actually getting our data returns. There are thinner areas where you might expect, in uplands and remote areas, which is a really similar problem for many other terrestrial surveillance. I'd even hazard to say all terrestrial surveillance schemes. But on the whole, we're doing really well. You can see we've got great representation of broadleaf woodland, lowland grassland habitats. Unsurprising that we have fewer data for those habitats that are rarer, and also those that are more difficult to access, like rocky outcrops and bogs. But we're still doing incredibly well for how young we are. And monitoring the NPMS habitat plots twice a year, every year, really provides an unparalleled opportunity to track and understand the responses of plants to our changing environment. It allows us to investigate the growing pressures on our environment. And as I say, it was around about the 5th season, I'd say, of our surveys is when we really started to see these stories emerge. So from things like extreme weather events, like the droughts of the summer in 2018, the NPMS data showed indications of increases of bare ground and an increase in the abundance of species that are better at tolerating these stresses, such as salad burnet and wild thyme. Certain orchid species are also being recorded in ever more northerly locations. Which is an indicator of warming climate, such as the bee orchid that we have pictured here, that's been recorded on the northern edge of its British range within the NPMS. To the increasing fertility, actually, of many of the UK habitats, particularly deciduous woodland. So monitoring key indicator species such as nettles and cleavers can really provide evidence of the effects of eutrophication and its impact on species intolerant to nitrogen. We're already seeing differences in habitats for these key indicators over time. So stinging nettle and cleavers, both species of highly fertile soil, have been recorded in around 40 and 35% of NPMS plots, respectively. So they are present in quite a large proportion. And also the impacts of non-native species, actually. The NPMS is the only citizen science project that allows us to see how the most invasive species, such as rhododendron, Himalayan balsam, Japanese rose, for example, are interactive with native plant biodiversity across Britain and Ireland. And here we can see the sycamore, the most frequently recorded alien within the NPMS, particularly in dry deciduous woodland and hedgerows. The habitats found to be invaded by the highest number of aliens we have found thus far to be arable field margins, hedgerows and dry deciduous woodlands. So the team can also highly scrutinise statistical models to get to plots that look a bit like these, that don't look hugely exciting, but actually are incredibly interesting. These were published in 2019 as a proposed experimental national indicator. So these are all examples of indicator species within the lowland grassland habitat category. And what we have here shows a percentage cover of each of these species, each of these 6 species on the y-axis, and through time on the x-axis. So along the bottom there. So from the top left, we've got yarrow, which was stable across 4 years. We have Yorkshire fog in the top middle, with more variable, but quite high cover, around 20%, reflecting its sort of often community dominant nature. We've got wild parsnip there, lower abundance, but perhaps increasing a bit across the time period. And then we have rarer species, such as the fragrant orchid in the bottom. Actually, that's in the bottom middle, which is a bit confusing, which actually wasn't recorded in the first few years of the scheme. So that was quite interesting. We've got the arable sow thistle, bottom left, with quite low cover, and then bottom right we have hop trefoil that we think may have increased in the drought year in 2018, where it did fairly well actually in gaps in grasslands, which might be something we see more of, and we may be able to detect more easily with climate change. So we are starting to build up a picture of of these individual species. But then ultimately we can combine all of those species, essentially taking average across all of those lines and saying, this is what the average positive indicator species are doing in lowland grasslands, for example, and come up with something like this. The value of this is somewhat limited over a short time series, sure. But as we are now approaching the 10-year anniversary of the scheme, and then beyond that, when we get to the point where we say the UK BMS and breeding bird surveyors with, say, 50, 70 years of data, these will be incredibly powerful and really useful in tracking these changes within communities and at the species level. And actually, I really always want to note about this, because a really major achievement for the NPMS is the experimental indicator. So towards the end of 2020, DEFRA and the JNCC published their UK biodiversity indicators. And these provide an annual view of how a variety of groups of wildlife and other indicators of action for biodiversity conservation have fared across the UK in recent years. And 2020 was a really landmark year for NPMS volunteers, because it marked the first ever contribution of NPMS data to a national biodiversity indicator. And in fact, it was the first time the annual habitat indicator, C7 it's called, has been contributed through volunteer effort. So specifically NPMS data from 4 of the scheme's best, or I should say the most surveyed, broad habitats seen here: arable field margins, bog and wet heath, broadleaf woodlands, hedgerows and lowland grasslands. Data from these habitats were used to create the new indicator for this category, C7, which is more perhaps a bit clearer called plants of the wider countryside. And the indicator is still classified as an experimental indicator as opposed to an official indicator, and work on this is ongoing, but just getting to that point in only 6 years of field surveys just highlights the incredible dedication of NPMS volunteers, the standard of the data that's being collected, and just really the dedication in getting out, establishing their plots, and collecting the data, and ultimately inputting it, and letting us know what they're seeing on their plots. And those 4 habitats, actually, I thought it was worth just showing, have really good national survey coverage relative to the habitat type. We have a reasonably representative coverage and picture, but we'll always be striving for more. Always, particularly in those geographical gaps. So of course, looking at percentage cover is one way of doing things, but there are actually many ways of looking at our data, looking at the NPMS data, and this is an example shown here is another way that we also provided in our most recent annual report, and we can look at counts of positive and negative indicators across broad habitats per plot, and the distribution of those during just a single year. So each year we can take a look, and you do have to take into account with the positive indicators on the left and the negative indicators on the right, that the x-axes are at different scales if you wanted to compare these. But you can see that the plot on the right has a much shorter scale, but if you take into account, we do see a few interesting patterns coming out of this one of which is that arable field margins is one of the few habitats where there are often more negative than positive indicators. And you can see that they, by the distribution of plots, you can see that's the case. Sometimes it's quite a striking difference, such as the native pinewood down the bottom there. You tend to have more positive indicators than negative. Similarly in bog and wet heath. This might be owing to the positive indicators of those habitats being more characteristics of those habitat types, of course, and more widespread. But it's definitely something that warrants a more in-depth look going forwards. And I suspect there's going to be more research into this going forwards. And the next couple of slides just cover a paper that we had published just towards the end of last year on a separate question again. It was investigating how well the NPMS plots and samples that we currently have sample a national gradient of climate change exposure. So this slide just offers some background really, and it shows on the right hand side the national UKCEH land cover map, which does what it says on the tin really. It's a map of all the broad scale habitat types across the UK. that you can see listed there. And what the new research conducted by the NPMS researchers at Plant Life and the UKCH and actually the University of York uses past observed and future modelled climate data to create an index of expected climate change in every 1 kilometre square of the UK. And this climate change exposure measure integrates changes in things such as seasonal temperatures, rainfall, and such to create a single estimate of how much overall climatic change is expected in any given location between various multi-year periods. And actually the results show how far human-driven climate change has shifted conditions from their state at the beginning of the 20th century and how much more change could be in store over the coming decades. And the authors reported that in each successive multi-year period studied, the UK's climate change exposure has increased drastically. Changes from the last decade to the 2021 to 2040 are predicted to be far larger again than those within the 20th century. It's quite a gloomy tale. And the paper shows that climate changes are affecting the UK unevenly. The paper states that regionally it falls more in southern, central and eastern England. Locally, it's greater at higher elevation locations than nearby areas at lower elevations. And in a worst case scenario for greenhouse gas emissions, much of England could experience Mediterranean type climatic conditions with hotter and drier summers by 2061. But what does that mean for our plants? Well, the warming temperatures have seen some wild plant species such as lizard orchid, bee orchid and pyramidal orchid we can see here expand their ranges. Some rare Arctic alpine plants, including Norwegian mugwort and mountain sandwort, are also likely to be at risk of going extinct in Britain as our uplands become more temperate. And human-driven climate change is likely to fall hardest on arable and horticultural land, also calcareous grasslands, so grasslands with a high pH, and also urban and suburban areas. And according to the findings of the research, it's our calcareous grasslands that are the most exposed semi-natural habitat to climate change in the next sort of 40-year period. And I've just popped in here last couple of examples. They're not uses of NPMS data that we've actually carried out within NPMS, because of course we spend most of our time or a lot of our time actually running the scheme, but where NPMS data have been used for another range of applications by other organisations. So the first example here is of a land cover map training, and this is a project from Natural England, the Living England map, where they've taken a whole raft of habitat data and used it to train or educate sort of an artificial intelligence algorithm, essentially then to classify satellite imagery and create those national habitat maps. So that was an incredibly useful use of NPMS data, and that's now already publicly available through a Magic portal. And a similar, though a little bit more abstract, actually, application was carried out by a team at UKCH in Lancaster. And what they did was they took plot community data from the NPMS, both habitat and species information, and linked it to other data from same monitoring schemes I've mentioned previously, and then created a statistical model of the attributes of those species and created national maps. So lots of very clever statistics that I must admit that I have no part in whatsoever, but really, really useful uses of the NPMS data. And the attributes that we can see listed here, we refer to characteristics of plants that indicate features of the environment. So certain plants have certain metrics associated with them. So we can look at those that tend to be used as indicators of things like fertility, moisture, light, soil pH. So if you have more species with higher fertility numbers, for example, typically you have a plot that indicates higher fertility. And with all that sort of NPMS species abundance data, these researchers are able to take that and create a national map of plant community fertility, just as an example of one of these metrics, by integrating all of those data set sources and using that abundance information associated with those species. And there have been a number of other uses. Looking at agri-environmental impact, NPMS data have also contributed to an assessment of how brownfield sites in certain landscapes support biodiversity across landscapes. They were highlighted as an important resource for national models of plant communities in a similar way to those maps we've just been looking at. So yes, huge number of uses. The NPMS species records go to the National Biodiversity Network, to the SBI for their distribution maps. And I believe in the last 9 years, there have been over 300 studies that have integrated NPMS observations, all from data collected by surveys carried out by our volunteers. So thank you very much for your contribution, because all of these squares, all the data from these squares really add up. So the last thing that I just wanted to say was that you can obviously find out a heck of a lot more than I've been able to offer in the last sort of 40 minutes about the NPMS on our website, which you've got the address there. All about the background, how it was started. You know, you can find out what research is currently underway, look at our annual reports, our newsletters, which are quite fun and offer quite a voice for the volunteers. We also have lots of survey guidance materials, but also lots of online training materials and resources, whether it's species ID or habitat classification guides, fun interactive workshops, whether it's an anatomy using keys and whatnot. But we also have some really nice community engagement events like art workshops, poetry workshops that are completely free. All of our training is completely free for NPMS volunteers. So as a group that has an NPMS square, of course, that offer extends to you chaps too. And we do a number of webinars that you can join, free public webinars on a range of different topics, from certain habitats right the way up to how to photograph plants for ID, real variety. And we also have our YouTube channel. Much like your YouTube channel, we record all of our training and pop it on our NPMS support YouTube channel. So there is a whole host of information out there on the scheme. So I think that's it. I hope I'm to time. I hope that's okay. And yes, that's all I wanted to talk to you guys about today. And as I say, to say thank you for your contribution. Oh,
thank you very much, Rachel. That was fascinating, and certainly got me more enthusiastic about the square that you've been monitoring. Before I open it up for questions, can I ask you one myself? One of the problems with our square is going year after year, it's pretty similar, and it's a woodland, the 3 plots we have. But as we saw on the kilometre map you showed us, we actually also have a bit of coast, and we have a cliff path down from that path, that long linear square. It sets off as a cliff path down to the coastline. How easy would it be for us to perhaps have a different habitat and start, to include one of those habitats in as well?
As long as you can safely access a site that you have permission to access, and you're comfortable going there, and it is representative of one of the NPMS habitat types, that would be absolutely fantastic. I noticed there are a couple of different habitat types within your square. Marine clifftops is one of the NPMS habitat types. So as long as it falls within your square, your survey square, that would be brilliant. It doesn't matter that you've been monitoring a different 3. You can add to your plots. You've just started surveying that one from 2024, as it were. That's absolutely fine. Am I right in thinking, I may be wrong, is there juniper scrub as well within your square? Am I right in saying that?
I don't think there's juniper scrub.
No, I'm thinking of something different. But yes, if you have other habitat types, that's brilliant. If you'd like to add any additional.
Okay. Well, maybe that's something we can talk about it when we're out surveying it later on this year.
definitely, it can be nice, can't it, to look at different habitats and get to know different, you know, the different makeup, different species within those habitats. It mixes things up a bit as well, doesn't it, when you're out there? So definitely that's a possibility.
But I'd like to open it up to anyone else who's got questions or comments they'd like to make to Rachel.
All the silence.
Hello, can I ask one?
Yes,
go-
Tim.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how it's 4.5 or 5,000 squares that were chosen originally, I think, from the slide you put up. How are those squares chosen as having a potentially representative cross section of British flora?
Yeah, so it's, do you know, I think it's somewhere between 2.5 and 3,000 squares we have altogether. So they were randomly generated, although having said that, the 1 kilometre squares that contained the NPMS habitats, those 11 broad scale habitats that we are particularly interested in, squares were weighted slightly so that we would have squares that include the habitats that we are interested in. As opposed to, you know, so that we're not just having lots of squares popping up in the middle of London, for example, sort of in urban habitats or whatnot. So they were randomly generated to avoid, of course, selection bias, because we're all super tempted to go somewhere that's particularly interesting, or dare I shouldn't say interesting, because everybody's very interesting. But of course, it's really important for us to also get absence data, or, you know, data in areas that perhaps aren't wouldn't have been originally considered to be surveyed. So yes, they're randomly generated, but with that slight weighting towards the habitats that we are interested in NPMS. It can be quite a common frustration. I think quite a few people say, oh, there's a really lovely, you know, patch or a reserve or something just down the road that I wouldn't need to pop into the car, but I'm afraid we have to stick to our designated squares.
I mean, that makes sense. Is there scope for also including data from other squares? If you say to someone, what we really want is from the squares, but if you want to monitor a little bit of somewhere else as well, is there scope for that?
So there is, we do have a facility. So for people who are registered with NPMS, as I say, this botany group does have an account with NPMS. There is also a recording form that just says extra species records. So there is a place to input additional data that has less information. So you don't record abundance, you just record what the species was, where you saw it. So that helps towards distribution maps. So there is that that space for any additional data as well, should you wish to include that. But in terms of adopting NPMS methodology in other areas, this is something that we have been piloting across the UK in the last 2 years, whereby sort of local groups, gosh, I'm trying to think who our pilot partners are currently. We have the Chilterns tracking the impact monitoring scheme. We have Bristol City Council, we've got Warwickshire Wildlife Trust that have taken on additional squares that they have sort of randomly generated within their own boundaries, so that they can record on more squares sort of in a more concentrated way on their own patch, so to speak. So they're using that tried and tested peer-reviewed methodology that's been found that's been really useful to monitor, but at that local scale. And for that, we have trialed there's a separate data repository called Plant Portal, actually, that the UKCEH are currently piloting. So we are piloting a means whereby people can set up sort of almost their own mini NPMS scheme within certain areas if they wish to monitor using that. But that doesn't then feed into, that data doesn't feed into the overall indicator analysis, of course, but it can be really useful in sort of local monitoring, certainly.
Sure,
We're hoping for more funding for that side of things, so we can offer more support, because I'm sort of supporting that as an extra thing at the moment. But it's a really good question, because I think when you've got such a solid, tried and tested, as I say, methodology that's been found to be accessible and usable and you know, can be used across the board, it makes sense, doesn't it, if you want to use, and then those organisations, as I say, also have a comparison what they're seeing within their boundaries to what we're seeing nationally. So
Yes, yeah.
I hope that it does. I hope that we do manage to move that forward from the pilot. So far, so good. Fingers crossed.
And what happens if one of your random squares falls on, let's say, a botanical garden or even just a an urban park? Do you exclude it?
So we don't necessarily exclude it. We would say just to see if there are any areas within that square that do happen to fall within an NPMS category. Quite often we can find something like a hedgerow or a road verge may be able to be, may well be classed as heath or lowland grassland, and it's absolutely fine for folk to just have one plot or two plots within a square. But if it's, a square that's completely inaccessible, inappropriate, then it would be excluded. So we do have some instances where we've got some squares that have fallen and they're basically mostly in the sea, but with a few rocks. That frankly just not very safe. The poor, I remember there's one, the poor volunteer said, well, I could get out there, I have to get on my boat and it's a little bit hairy and it's a bit choppy, and we said, you know what, it's not worth your, risking your health. They weren't very comfortable doing it. Or we've had squares that we've had to exclude because they're not safe because they fall on MOD, training ground. Which, although having said that, the MOD are also very supportive of NPMS, and we do have a lot of squares actually that overlap with MOD land, but some maybe just aren't suitable. Some we've been told please don't, because it's where there are breeding birds. So there are some squares that we have needed to exclude just because they're not, it's not possible to survey on them, or not practical.
So if it fell entirely on, let's say, Kew Gardens in London, because that's quite large, as well as being full of exotic stuff, you would have left that in and just looked for roadside verges?
I would be unlikely that I think that there would be the semi-natural habitats within that, but we would take a look at it and see if there were any plots of semi-natural habitat within it, but it would seem unlikely.
Right.
I'd be surprised if it was selected through the randomization process.
One or two.
Although having said that, I've got a feeling that Buckingham Palace Gardens fall within the NPMS scheme, and we do have a volunteer, so you never know.
Thanks.
Fiona, I think, has got her hand up. Yeah.
Hello. I was wondering, up here, a lot of people seem to do the inventory list because a lot of the indicator species just simply aren't there in many of our plots. I can understand why you work basically on the inventory list for analysis, but is it worthwhile doing the inventory plots? Do other people use the data from those?
Yeah, we do. So the inventory plots are just as useful as doing the indicator plots because, if things aren't there, that absence data, as I say, is just as important. So by doing the inventory data, you're almost sort of by proxy doing an indicator level survey, because we're seeing what of those indicators are there or are not there. And by doing the inventory level, we are getting that additional level of information. We are seeing what other species are present. It does contribute to sort of a bigger picture of the plot. And as I say, it's also really useful for our distribution mapping. Even if not our abundance mapping, it's really useful for the distribution mapping. So it certainly is really useful. And I would say that between the three different survey levels, we've got a really even divide. Actually, I'd say it's about a third each, people recording at the wildflower level, indicator level and inventory level, which is really lovely and actually really encouraging, because more people, I would say, sign up and start at the wildflower level, so people are obviously feeling like they're getting more confident and moving up towards the indicator level. The other thing on that front is, if you did decide to extend and have additional plots in other habitats, that is something that other volunteers do, is actually survey at different levels at different plots. As long as you're consistent with your survey and your plots, that's possible. So, you may get to a lowland grassland plot, for example, or a marine clifftop plot and decide to do it at an indicator level, whether, owing to experience or, ease of ID or purely just time. that you have to spend on a survey, that's absolutely possible as well. Some folk actually say, do you know what, I'm super duper confident in woodlands, but put me on a grassland and I start to, you know, my knees start to wobble a little bit, and I think I'm going to do that at the indicator level. So yes, that's another possibility.
Thank you.
Can I ask
Right.
Was that Rebecca?
Sorry, Elizabeth. Do you want to go first, Elizabeth?
No, you go first, Rebecca.
Oh, thank you. So this is slightly off piste, but like you mentioned about grasslands and the way that different grasslands are potentially impacted differently by climate change and calcareous grassland. And I just wondered, do you know why? Like I could guess maybe like thinner soils and things like that, but do you know what the report said and what they thought?
So to be honest, I don't think it's gone into a huge amount of detail. It was just looking at which land cover. But as you say, I think we could probably start to think about those reasons in terms of, yes, thinner soil, more likely to be impacted by drought, for example, and just the types of species that generally prefer those habitats not being, you know, particularly robust in the changing climate and in the climate that we are expecting. That study, I don't believe it just went into the different habitat types. It didn't go too much into detail, but I can well see that that's where the research is going. I can imagine that's going to be the next question.
Yeah, well, it might just be that the distribution of calcareous grassland is in that southeast region, and
Yeah.
maybe those are just going to get really hit. It might not necessarily be generic, but I don't know. Yeah,
I think it's going to be, I mean, like many of these things, I think there's going to be a lot of there's a lot of variables and a lot of factors all working together. And
Okay,
as you
very
say, I think
interesting.
there's quite a lot. I think there's quite poor, you know, the poor calcareous grasslands. There's quite a lot sort of against them almost in that respect. There's quite a few factors there.
Okay, thanks very much. It's very interesting talk.
I hope it's, I don't know, it's inspired you guys ahead of the field season, which we will be starting around April this year. And certainly if you need any further help at all with new plots or you know, even new squares or anything like that, or inputting data, anything at all, you know, to get in touch with myself and my colleague Karen. And as I say, please do make use of, you know, if you want any further information about any of our free webinars or training events for all the members, please do just shout and I can let you know what we've got coming up as well.
I'd like to second that. I've taken part in some of I've followed some of the training, NPMS training over the last couple of years on things like grasses, which I struggle with for identifying in our plot. And it's been really, really useful, very, very useful. You can go back and repeat it as well the next season, which I think I'll have to do before we start in monitoring our square this year. The POAs are always a challenge.
Oh, yeah, and refresh it when you've had a good few months away from it as well. It's, yeah, so we try and do a few bits and pieces over the winter, just sort of keep our eye in and keep the interest up. It can be tricky.
But that, if there's no other question, just like to thank you very much for taking up giving up your time, getting away from bedtime with the kids.
You got me out of bedtime.
That's right.
Hey, did you have your hand up a moment ago? No.
No.
No, sorry, I thought I saw Kathy's hand up a moment ago, but
No one else. No, I can't see any hands up. So
yeah, sorry, I did have mine up. I was just a bit of a tangent. You were talking about climate change, and I wondered what your anticipation was about the changing ocean currents, particularly in regards to Scotland.
Oh gosh, now you're asking. Oh God, I wouldn't like to say. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with the area at all. Up by you chaps, other than I think we're seeing an awful lot of shift in where I'm particularly interested, or historically I was particularly interested in top predators, your seabirds, your dolphins, and where we're finding that they're sort of they're feeding, even where they're breeding, really shifting. So not just thinking about numbers of different species, but actually where different really important life cycle events are occurring, we are seeing really, really large shifts.
Yeah, I was
Particularly
thinking there was a recent, I think, Guardian article on the Gulf Stream, and then just one after that saying, no, they got that confused with the other big ocean current, but with sort of drastic implications for cooling and, you know, more storm events and things like that, particularly on the west of Scotland. That was, and I thought, well, that would presumably have an impact. I mean, I agree with you. It's just so multiple variables. It's hard to predict, but.
So hard to predict, and unfortunately all of the predictions that are being attempted and all of the research are painting a rather dire picture, as you say, as those articles have been showing. It's quite a concerning time, and it's awful, isn't it, trying to almost not sit and wait to see, but not really knowing, which we can never can predict things like this, but it's, yes, as you say, it's very, very difficult to predict.
That was a great talk. Thank you. And so my apologies for arriving a bit late. It was 6:30 in the morning over here. So.
Oh gosh. Hello. Wherever you're joining us from. That's exciting.
Oh yes, the Inverness Botany Group has worldwide membership. You might think we're all north of Scotland, but no.
Joe, I spoke to a botany group in Manchester recently, and one of the members was joining actually just from down the road from me in Somerset, and I thought, that was quite interesting. Wasn't what I was expecting. That's a good thing about these online courts, isn't it? You can join from wherever we are.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's made, you know, because our membership is quite widely dispersed. I mean, apart from the overseas members, quite widely dispersed. It means that people can take part where previously, when we were just had face-to-face speakers, it was difficult, especially in the winter months up here. And also we've access to speakers like yourself from Somerset, whereas before completely outside.
I sound like I'm from Somerset, because I'm not, of course. That's where I am now.
Yes, yes. But thank you very much for giving us
Thank you for having me.
It was really, really fascinating, and especially to see what's happening with the records where everyone's putting in. And hopefully in another 10 years' time, there'll be a lot more significant, the findings.
Yeah.
So we'll just have to keep on.
Thank you. Thank you ever so much for having me, and as I say, for your contribution. So.
Well, thank you.